All right, so black cards. First one up is Archfiend of Sorrows. So it's a 5-mana 4/5 flyer that has an ETB ability that says creatures your opponents control get -2/-2 until end of turn. So like an infest style of effect, right? Reign of Sorrows, whatever it is. It also has, of course, Unearth for 3 and 2 black, which allows you to get it back from your graveyard with haste, but you have to exile it at the beginning of your next end step. So you basically get it as a one-shot sort of lava axe effect with a good ETB trigger. I'm not particularly high on this card. I do believe that it is too expensive and too clunky to ever really make waves in all but the lowest power commander pods. But still, it's a reasonable ETB effect on a reasonable body with an unearth ability, just as gravy. I just think that paying 7 mana for this effect is way too much. Like, again, for 7 mana, I could cast, I don't know, like, basically, like, you know, let me put it this way, for 6 mana, I can play Massacre Worm or something, right? For 7 mana, I can play Sheldrin. Like, there are better cards to cast in your black decks. So I don't think Archfiend of Sorrows is it, but there are probably some decks where it is okay. Next, we have Archon of Cruelty, which I'm going to pass on only because it says the words target opponent, which to me basically says this is a plant for modern as a reanimator target. We'll see a little bit later in black, but like they've printed a couple of like pretty interesting spells that like very much indicate that they're trying to push reanimator as an archetype for modern. But again, if you're paying 8 mana, or even if you're playing, you know, casting reanimation spells, effects that only target one opponent, like, they've been power crept out of the format. Like, whatever your thoughts on that may or may not be, that like, you know, oh, back in my day, you know, nothing ever said each opponent, and we made do, and that was okay. That's just not where the format's at anymore. If you want your cards to be good enough, they need to do something to everybody. And in this case, the effect is just not, like, targeting one person with this effect, as good as that would be, right? So I'll read it just to do the due diligence. But yeah, so target opponent sacks a creature or walker, discards a card and loses 3 life. You draw a card and gain 3 life. So it's sort of like a riff on, like, you know, it's even got the bolus horns in the background here, right? It's a riff on Cruel Ultimatum, but it doesn't stack up. It actually costs more than Cruel Ultimatum, though, mind you, it's mono black as opposed to triple colored with all colored pips or whatever, but like, yeah, I don't know. This ain't it. There are better reanimation targets in black. This, to me, like I said, reads like a 1v1 modern plant. It might actually be very good in modern, though. Reanimating this on as early as like turn 2 or 3 and getting like a 6-man, like a flying 6/6 with that ability is pretty ridiculous. So I wouldn't be shocked to see this be like really good in modern, but this ain't it for Commander. Moving on, we've got Break the Ice. I definitely know that there was some buzz around this card. Land destruction usually does tend to garner some buzz. So this is black, destroy target land that is snow or that could produce colorless mana. So, you know, obviously this is a pretty direct reference back to Sinkhole, which is just black, destroy target land. So this one is obviously more narrow than that, right? You can't destroy every land, but it does punish the emerging trend of snow basics in Commander, which was up until now essentially just entirely free of downside and had a lot of potential mechanical upside. And so again, if you're in a play group where your opponents have all just been starting to like play a bunch of snow basics because it's free, you know, you could get them by playing this card, and suddenly guess what? It's not that free anymore. Or again, if you've got like, you know, not like a literal Tron player in Commander necessarily, but you know, somebody's got that really annoying Kozilek EDH deck. This is a good way to shut those colorless decks down pretty hard. And the reason for that is, of course, because although it does not have the flexibility of Sinkhole in terms of targeting any land, that is because it also has Overload for 4 and 2 black, which means that if you do overload it, you get to blow up every land that meets this requirement, which means you are potentially wreaking a lot of havoc on your opponent's mana bases. So this is not a black staple, this is not an auto-include the way I've seen a lot of people talking about it, but what it is a very strong role player in pods. Basically what's going to happen is you're going to have certain pods that are basically either colorless or snow skewed right now, where someone else is basically going to start playing Break the Ice. They're going to break a lot of ice, and then people are going to stop playing those lands and kind of go back to slightly less greedy mana bases, at which point you can probably just slide the Break the Ice right back out again. And there's going to be this ebb and flow of, like, I play Break the Ice if my play group is playing these snow lands and these colorless lands, and I don't if they're not. And you kind of bring it in and out of your deck depending on whether or not you believe that that is a necessary thing to be doing. So I think it's a really cool card to exist. I think it brings a lot of like, it's a good balancing tool, but I don't think it's particularly good on its own merits. You really want a pretty heavy snow and or colorless meta before this is a card that I would be willing to spend one of my 99, 98 if we're counting Soul Ring slots on. Okay, another instance of you'll know if you want this. Let's see what else we have. We got Chittering Augur, which is like a weird card. Like, it's got a cool little ETB ability, right? So for 2 and so it's a 2 mana 1/1 at ETBs, you draw a card and you lose a life. So it's very similar to that vampire from Ixalan that does that. However, this one can't block, which is not great, but it also has 4 mana, return it from your graveyard to your hand. Now, the biggest problem I have with this card is that obviously you can't use this as a chump block, right? You actually have to be actively sacrificing it in order to get it into your graveyard to then get it back and get value. It's not doing enough, in my opinion, to be worth a slot in all but the most dedicated self-sacrifice decks. And even then, it might not be worth it, but it's not unplayable either. So, your mileage may vary. This will be a role player in the decks that want it, but it's not going to see a lot of play, I would imagine. Okay, cards that are going to see a lot of play, though. So the first one is Damn. Just one of the most, succinct, clean to the point card names I think I've ever seen. It's certainly a very evocative name, just Damn. And, the joke, I guess, partially being that that's what your opponents are going to say a lot of the time when you cast this. So this is a weird hybrid between, I don't know. I guess the black mode doesn't have a precedent. There's no sorcery speed. I mean, I guess it's Terminate. Basically, it's a sorcery speed Terminate, right? Destroy target creature. It can't be regenerated for black. But you can overload it and just turn it into literal, actual, factual Wrath of God, or, Damnation. Although the cost is Wrath of God. So the most important thing to note here is that although this is a black card, if you're playing Commander, this is a black-white card. This is a gold card for the purposes of Commander because the off-color Overload makes it so that you cannot play it in a deck that is not both white and black in terms of color identity. So, be advised, don't play this in your black-green decks, for instance. That you're going to get called out. But this is an absurdly powerful and flexible effect. It's a single target removal spell that is also simultaneously a wrath effect, depending on what the board currently seems to be calling for, right? One problematic creature, cast Damn. Multiple problematic creatures, you're behind on board, overload it, and now you've got a Wrath of God. So, like, it's really, really flexible, and it's not charging you an unreasonable amount. I would say the biggest downside is that it's a sorcery, but it has to be a sorcery because otherwise, you could overload it at instant speed, and then you would just have an instant speed Wrath of God, and that would be bonkers, so we're not doing that. I think this card is fantastic. I think this is pretty damn close to a black-white staple. I don't think literally every black-white deck ever is going to want this necessarily, but I think that far more will than won't. Very, very cool card. Very impressive. Damn. Next one is Douthie Voidwalker. This is, of course, a throwback to all of the Douthie creatures from, God, what I want to say is like the Masks block, I think, or something. That all have Shadow. So, of course, Shadow is like a weird version of flying where only other creatures with Shadow can block or be blocked by Shadow creatures. It's a 2-mana 3/2 with Shadow, so it's a 2-mana 3/2 unblockable, effectively. And it says, if a card will be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile it with a void counter on it. So it's incidental graveyard hate because, yeah, anytime a creature dies or is discarded or wheeled away or whatever. Oh, sorry, also not a creature, just any card. So any spell that gets cast, right, I cast, a draw spell, it's now exiled with a void counter on it. So this is just like blanket graveyard hate, but there's an additional rider on the Voidwalker that says choose an exiled card an opponent owns with a void counter on it. You may play it this turn without paying its mana cost. So a scenario that I saw come up, and this is arguably more of a modern scenario, but I'll just use it for the purposes of being succinct. You play Doubthy Voidwalker on 2, and then you cast the Thoughtseize effect. Your opponent has an Ugin in hand. You make them discard their Ugin. Now, rather than being discarded to the graveyard, it is now exiled the Doubthy Voidwalker's effect. And now you get to tap sack Doubthy Voidwalker and cast an Ugin for 0 mana on turn 3 after Thoughtseizing your opponent. That's ridiculous. The without paying its mana cost part should not be underrated. Like, this effect is obscenely powerful. If you're able to control your opponent's hand or battlefield in any way, the turn after untapping with this, you're just going to get value. You're just never not going to get value. And that's pretty silly. This card is very, very good. And will probably get expensive because I think that it is modern playable. This is one of the more pushed modern cards I've seen, just because it pairs so well with Inquisition and Thoughtseize effects. But even in Commander, again, just getting to free cast something is never a bad effect. Discerning Taste is, worth a brief mention. It's just yet another in a line of many cards that just, gives you a card to your hand and dumps a bunch into your yard. So, if you're doing graveyard things, this is nice. Echoing Return, Fuse Sanity, Flay Essence, kind of moving on. Grief is very similar to Archon of Cruelty, where unlike other effects, because of the fact that it's a discard spell, it just doesn't scale well to multiplayer. Like, a 4-mana 3/2 menace that makes one opponent reveal their hand and discard a card is not great. And definitely you don't ever want to be evoking this realistically. If this took a card from each of your opponents, I think it would be pretty reasonably playable, but as it is not great. I don't think it's a good card at all. It's all mostly also just thank me later, save your money, because this card is going to be very expensive for modern purposes and maybe legacy, etc. So you don't need to be chasing after a super expensive card in a format where it's not that good. Great card for modern, I believe. Maybe I'll be proved wrong, but certainly the hype seems to imply it will be, but I don't think this is a card for Commander. What else do we have? Nothing terribly exciting happening here. Magus of the Bridge is another one, another Magus in the long line of printing enchantment and artifact and land effects on creatures and making them measurably worse in the process. Bridge from Below was not really an EDH playable card in the first place. Magus of the Bridge, even less so. Just ignore this card. Necrogoif is pretty powerful, I think, but kind of comes with a bit of a user warning of, like, it's a pretty griefy card. So I would not play this in a play group where my opponents were not doing equally griefy things, because forcing everybody to discard a card at the beginning of their hand is just really obnoxious. Like, you're not going to make friends with this. But I mean, again, it's going to go into, a lot of decks, right? This is good in Tiny Bones. This is good in Haunt of Hightower or whatever it's called. This is good in Turgrid. It's good in Nath the Guilt Leaf. Like, all these decks that just inherently want you to be discarding cards already, like, it's good there. But, and it does have Madness, notably, so if you're discarding your own cards for whatever reason, you can cast this for free off of a discard trigger, which is obviously, pretty, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. Pretty great. But like I said, its actual effect is irritating and not going to make you friends at the table. So be advised. If you play this card, you're not making friends. But if that's cool with your play group, then this is actually pretty powerful, because it's potentially a 7/4, 8/4, 10/4 without that much work, because it does count all creatures in all graveyards. Okay, let's talk about Persist. So Persist is right up there with Suspend in terms of cards that are named after the literal mechanic that they're referencing. It's clean design at the end of the day. Notably, so basically, let's read it first. So 1 under black for a sorcery, return target non-legendary creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on it. So of course, the -1/-1 counter refers to the fact that when a creature persists, it has died and it comes back, but you put a -1/-1 counter on it. So this is basically just you're sort of artificially persisting a creature after the fact. Now, the most notable rider on this, of course, is non-legendary. So there are a lot of very powerful legendary cards that you could reanimate, but not with this. So this isn't going to be bringing back your Vilis Broker of Blood and your Elish Norns and your... I don't know what else you're bringing back with your reanimator spells. But what it is bringing back is it's bringing back things like... well, of course, now I'm drawing a blank and I have to think about it. But it's bringing back things like, I don't know, Sphinx of Uthun. I don't even know if that card is still playable, but once upon a time, that was a pretty powerful card. It is bringing back, for example, my goodness, I'm forgetting what it's called. Runescarred Demon. That's not a legendary creature. So you can bring back Runescarred Demon for 2 mana with this and go, you get yourself a, I think it's a 6/6 normally, so you get yourself a 5/5 Demonic Tutor with flying, right? Like, Persist is very good. Just don't forget that it can't bring back legendary creatures. You don't want to like set up a play that doesn't work. But, if you take a look, if you as the viewer, the average reanimator player out there takes a look at your deck in your graveyard, you'll probably find that there are a fair bit of decent, a fair few decent non-legendary creatures you can bring back. And for 2 mana, that's a very low cost, even if it does shrink the creature a little bit. Like, it's great if you've got ETB creatures and stuff like that. Just again, don't forget, doesn't work on your legendaries, but it's super powerful. Similarly, in terms of sort of super powerful effects, you have Profane Tutor, which is, of course, Demonic Tutor with Suspend. So you pay the Demonic Tutor cost, and you get it 2 turns later. So you're basically paying the Demonic Tutor rate, but you're getting it on the turn that Diabolic Tutor would go off. However, on that turn, you're paying 0 mana instead of 4 mana, which means, once again, I actually think this card is quite good. It's not better than Demonic Tutor, it just isn't. But I actually think it is better than Diabolic Tutor, and even probably better than Grim Tutor and whatnot, because what it does is that on the turn you can play it, which is, turn 4 or later, you, for 0 mana, get to go find the best card for the board right now. So, you may have a card in mind when you suspend this card, but 2 turns from now, the board is going to look wildly different. That's just how Commander works. And so you're going to get to pay 0 mana to go get the best card for the board on that turn, which means, and it's still accomplishing its tutoring objective that turn, which is really, really powerful. I think it's super, super good. I'm just noticing that my captions are like flailing wildly around. So hang on 1 second. Why is that happening? Why are you doing that? This is so weird. I don't know why it's doing this. It's got like a side scroll bar now for no particular reason. That's upsetting. Okay, we're going to do this and hopefully this makes it work. Let's see if this happens. Okay. I guess this just wants to be on 110% zoom in order to work properly. Okay, well, apologies for the brief aside there. I think this works now. Yeah? Okay, yeah, we're back to normal. I don't know what the hell happened there. That was weird. Very, very weird. But anyway, back to the cards. Yeah, basically Profane Tutor is worse than Demonic Tutor, but I think better than almost every other tutor in terms of the flexibility that it affords you. If you have like 25 mana, then Diabolic Tutor is probably still better than this because you get the card right away. But in terms of like what you're getting versus what you're paying, this card does a lot of work as long as it's not incredibly time sensitive for you to get a specific card. If time is of the essence, this card is bad. If flexibility is of the essence, this card is better than most tutors other than actual factual Demonic Tutor, I think. Moving on, I really like Sinister Starfish just as a cute throwback to Sigiled Starfish, where in which case basically shifting from blue to black shifted it from Scry to Surveil, which I believe is the better commander mechanic because your graveyard is just more of your hand, as we all know. Sudden Edict is obviously a fun rift between Sudden Death and Diabolic Edict. It is fine. I mean, a split-second Edict means your opponent can't flash in a better creature to stop, to counter this, and they also just can't literally counter it. But I still don't think Edict effects are particularly powerful, so, you know, I wouldn't play it. Turok, Dreadcantor. So after all these years, the hymn to Turok finally reveals who the hell Turok is. And it turns out that he is a 2-mana 2/1 with kicker of black and protection from white, which says that whenever an opponent discards a card, you get to put a 1/1 counter on Turok. And when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, they discard 2 cards at random. So basically, it's a 2-mana 2/1 with kicker, hymn to Turok. And of course, it'll put 2 counters on it. So essentially, if you paid the kicker cost and your opponent had 2 cards to discard, it will essentially be a 4-mana 4/3 with the protection from white and whenever an opponent discards abilities, which is honestly a little underwhelming, frankly. I was expecting more from, like, the person after whom arguably one of the best discard spells of all time was named. But hey, sometimes, this is a bit of a never meet your hero situation, unfortunately, where it's not a bad card by any stretch, but it's not a particularly good card either. Again, if you're playing a discard tribal deck, why? Be nicer to people, but B, it'll fit into those decks. I would make it the commander, though. Like, I think this is just, like, strictly worse than Tiny Bones, probably worse than Turgid, etc., etc. But it will be a role player in certain decks. And again, I'd be remiss not to mention it, since it is a legendary creature. But I think that what it's doing is better done by other mono-black discard Cares generals. Commanders, I should say. So, yeah, I'm not super enthused by it, certainly. All right, moving on to the next card. Tragic Fall is a bit of an amusing one. Obviously, it's a bit of a riff on. I guess it's basically a mix between Fatal Push and Tragic Slip, where Tragic Slip is a 1-mana -1/-1 that gives -13, -13 if a creature died this turn already. This one is a little bit different because it's at base -3, -3, which makes it just better than Last Gasp, which is just 2 in a black, or 1 in a black instant target creature gets -3/-3, because it has Hellbent -13, -13, where Hellbent, of course, is if you have no cards in hand. I think it's an amusing card. It's got a lot of references to lots of other classic black kill spells. It's not a very good card, though. Underworld Hermit is extremely amusing. It is a 6-mana 3/3 peasant that makes a number of green squirrel creature tokens equal to your devotion to black. So, I don't know, that's fun to me. It is at worst a 6-mana 3/3 that makes 2 1/1s. But, if you've got like 1 or 2 other random black pips kicking around, it'll make a decent number of squirrels. Deranged Hermit, this is not. But it is a fun little card. You may see some decks that care about this, notably Squirrel Tribal decks. But Squirrels are primarily in green, and so I don't know how much Devotion to Black a Squirrel Tribal deck is going to have. Time will tell. We'll get to the official Squirrel Tribal commander when we get to green. And we can talk about that a little bit more later. I think that in a literal Squirrel Tribal deck, this might be okay. Otherwise, it's kind of whatever. It might actually just be good in any general Devotion to Black deck as well. If you're playing a heavy Black Devotion deck, just this entering and making, like, I don't know, 6+ squirrels is a very powerful effect. That's a lot of tokens. And you can turn them into mana via, like, Altar, Phyrexian Altar / Ashnod's Altar type stuff. You can turn them into cards. You can turn them into cards via Skull Clamp. There's a lot you can do with this card, but 6 mana is a lot. So you want to be making sure you're getting a lot of squirrels before this kicks off. All the Squirrel Tribal stuff we'll get to mostly in the green part of the review, because that is where it's mostly focused. The next card is Unmarked Grave, which is sort of the the balanced entomb. Like, so basically, if persist was the balance animate dead / reanimate effect for modern, where it's not then unmarked grave is the balanced entomb. So entomb, of course, being 1 mana instant, put any card from your graveyard from your library into your graveyard. This is 2 mana sorcery, put a non-legendary card into your graveyard. It's good. Again, it's substantially worse than Entomb, but Entomb is the best version of that effect that will ever exist because it can't be cheaper than 1 black, right? They could make it like 1 colorless, but that would be weird and not color abiding. But they can't make it cheaper without changing its color. They can change the color and give it to a different color, but yeah. It's the cheapest in black you'll ever get, so it's impossible to get better. Unmarked Grave is still pretty close, though. If you're looking to put dump cards in your yard, you could do a lot worse than Unmarked Grave. Again, remember, it won't be able to work on legendaries, but again, you can put your Grave Titans and whatever, and then reanimate them with Entomb. Grave Titan actually is a card that would be that works great with Persist. Unmarked Grave into Persist a Grave Titan is a pretty powerful effect. And that's just in black, right? If you're playing in, Black X, then you've got other options too, which is great. I do think this will be a role player in Modern. Again, this is my extremely armchair appraisal of that, but I also think that it's good in Commander. Entomb effects are very powerful, and a 2-mana Entomb is still pretty good, despite being a sorcery and costing twice as much. It's not better, and it won't replace Entomb, but if you want a second effect, or a second copy of that effect, this is not bad. Actually, yeah, and when it rains, it pours, as it turns out, because, yeah, the next card I want to talk about is Violent Tumor, which, as you might guess, has something to do with entombing. So 2 and 2 black for a 2/2 Death Touch. When it enters the battlefield, search your library for a card, and then put that card into your graveyard, then shuffle. So again, the enter the battlefield effect is just Entomb. Actual Entomb in this case. However, it does cost 4, and is by default sorcery speed because it's a creature. But you do get a Death Touch body, and it's blinkable. So again, this is a recurable effect, right? You can reanimate this in order to entomb another card. So it's not an incredible card or anything, but it is a flexible and powerful effect, and it gives you a decent body, right? A 2/2 Death Touch is not a body you can just ignore if your opponent is trying to attack on the ground at all. This will trade for a card if they ever attack you. Probably. Unless they have only indestructible attackers or something. But yeah. It's a little clunky, right? 4 mana is not a bargain or anything, but it's a powerful effect on a reasonable body for a reasonable rate. And then again, what do you pair with your Violent Tumor? What do you combo this with? Is, of course, Young Necromancer. Young Necromancer is, of course, an expansion on the Young Pyromancer, right? Young Pyromancer sought to emulate Chandra. Young Necromancer, of course, seeks to emulate Liliana. Right, little girl, she's got her little Liliana cosplay on and everything, and she's, doing her best to learn how to reanimate creatures, right? She's not as good as the Master, but she's doing all right. So 5 mana for a 2/3. That when it enters the battlefield, you can exile 2 cards from your graveyard, and when you do, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this requires a little bit of setup, right? You got to have 3 cards in your yard, including 2 of which you don't care about exiling forever, and 1 of which you want to reanimate. But it is a reanimate effect, and it doesn't cost you like any life or anything like that. So like the closest comparison here for me is Phyrexian Delver, which is a 5 mana 3/2. That says when it enters the battlefield, reanimate target creature, you lose life equal to that creature's converted mana cost. So this card saves you the pain of paying the life, but requires more to be going on in your graveyard, and also to have, as I said, 2 cards that you're willing to give up on forever in order to do this effect. That being said, it's not a bad version of that effect, right? It's not substantially worse than Phyrexian Reclaimer. Or Phyrexian Delver, sorry. Though it does require you to jump through a few more hoops. Blinking it is also a little bit trickier, although blinking either of these cards gets painful after a while. This one is going to strip your mind in your graveyard. The other one's going to destroy your life total. So depends on which cost is easier for you to pay at which stage in the game, basically. Not a bad card, though, and a card that I actually will expect to see play in Commander. I may actually have a deck in mind for this card myself. But yeah, don't sleep on this card. It's not like a freebie or anything like that, but a creature that reanimates another creature in a way that is recurable through blinking or reanimation is not to be underestimated, in my opinion. But that brings us to the end of the black cards for Commander, because, of course, as you can see, everything else is a reprint.